You're watching the interview here on France 24. Today I'm joined by a man described as a voice of Wall Street and a voice of corporate America. A New York Times columnist and the author of the best-selling book Too Big to Fail, a book which gives a blow-by-blow account of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the rescue of other Wall Street banks back in the fall of 2008. Now, HBO has just turned Too Big to Fail into a film in which my guest has a cameo role. Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, The Economist newspaper is joking your book, with its 640 pages, is probably too big to read for some people. So those people will be glad to know the film exists. What's the relevance of Too Big to Fail now, some 3 years after the collapse of Lehman Brothers?
Well, I think the purpose of the project, the film project, is really to remind people, frankly, what actually happened 2 and 3 years ago. I think today memories are so short, and we are already off to the next issue. And when you think about the regulation that's still on the table that hasn't happened, when you think about the choices that were on the table or weren't on the table, there's been, I don't want to say a revising of history, but today we look back at that period and we have our ideas of who's wearing the black hat and who's wearing the white hat. But when you get inside the room and you can actually visually see what the choices that were on the table were and what the opportunities were and what they weren't, I think your field of vision changes. Nothing is black and white. Everything becomes gray. And I think that's, in fact, what the film is ultimately about.
So are you saying that people talking about back in the day, back in those days,
Right.
3 years ago, does that mean that we're now into a new chapter, or have lessons therefore been learnt and taken on board from that?
Well, I think there's two components to this. From a very macro perspective, sadly, actually very little has been learned. I'm actually surprised. I may be naive. I would have thought we would have learned a lot more. I thought Wall Street would be a very different place. I think the ethos of the financial services industry is still the same. The sense that greed, as they said in the movie, not my movie, but Wall Street back in the 80s, greed, for lack of a better word, is good. And I think that hasn't changed. Having said that, for all the talk that nothing's changed on Wall Street, profits are starting to come down. I think you're ultimately going to see compensation come down. I think some of the fancy derivatives and other financial instruments that put us in this position are starting to fall away. And slowly, it's probably not happening as fast as we would all want or in a way that we can all see. But I do think Wall Street is changing. And in many ways, probably for the better in that respect. Probably worse for their own pocketbooks, though.
And you've written in the last couple of days, in fact, that there may be some layoffs on the horizon in Wall Street. Why do you think
well, I think there's a sense that between what's happening in Greece, the choppiness of the market, the debt ceiling issue in the United States, and frankly sort of a malaise in the economy, that there's a lot less banking work to be done. And then you add on top of that the regulations that have been put into place around derivatives, around some of around all the transparency we're trying to add. Well, that transparency is removing some of the most profitable businesses that Wall Street pursued, and they were able to get away with it because nobody really could see it. Now that people can see it, that business doesn't exist anymore. So banks ultimately are not going to be as profitable. They're going to become hopefully boring businesses. Maybe that's the goal. But as a result, that means that there's going to be less people working on the street. And so there are going to be headlines over the next couple of months where you're going to see people firms deciding that they actually have to lay off some people.
You mentioned Greece there, and I wanted to pick you up on that.
Right.
Is a country too big to fail?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the great lesson, when I started writing this book, we use the phrase too big to fail only in the context of financial institutions. Now we talk about it in the context of countries like Greece. We talk about it in the context of municipalities in the U.S., states. I mean, this has now gone to a completely different level and, frankly, a much worse level. The crisis that we lived through in 2008 was about debt and leverage in the financial system. The crisis that we're living through today, the sequel to this book, which I hope I don't have to write, is about the debt and leverage that we've taken on as a society in a much broader way.
So your prognosis sounds fairly bleak.
I'm not hopeful. That's not to say that we're going to have another financial crisis tomorrow, but I don't know how you get yourself out of this in the long term. This is about debt and leverage. That's what happened. That's what every financial crisis is ultimately about. And the question is, how do you unravel that? And in this case, I think we have overextended ourselves and are unwilling, politically in most cases, to take the necessary measures to peel that back. And what does that mean? It ultimately means about changing our lifestyles, about changing our way of life and the services that we have and all of that. And that's very difficult to get people to get behind, because it's about sacrifice. And nobody wants to sacrifice when it actually comes down to being about them.
Well, exactly, and that's what we're seeing with the austerity plans that no one seems to be very happy about. Where do you think it all went so wrong for Greece and the other most ailing European economies?
You know, in some respects, and I actually had a conversation with an executive in Greece, he actually blamed the U.S. He said, look, we were all trying to follow this capitalist movement. This, we saw what you guys were doing, and we followed this. And I think in some cases they did follow it, but it was all taken to an extreme. And I think that was the problem. The sense that you could take on all this leverage, that the risk wasn't there, that we'd built all these other instruments that would make all of this less risky. And in fact, what it really did was create more risk.
And what's the word on the street in the United States about Europe? Give us a view from across the Atlantic of our continent, our single currency bloc.
I think there's a great worry that it's going to splinter. I think there's a great worry about where Germany is ultimately going to have to stand in all of this, because they are the ones that are going to, I think our sense is they're the only ones who've at least figured out something good. And so they're going to have to do something about this. And what kind of pain are they going to want to take ultimately?
And it's a time when we'd obviously like to have someone quite strong at the helm of the IMF, and there's a vacancy there. Is there a preferred candidate? Is it Lagarde or Carstens? Which one is the preferred candidate?
I don't know if there's a preferred candidate. I think there's a sense that Lagarde was going to get it. I don't know if she's preferred or not, but I think that's the sort of conventional wisdom.
I want to ask you a little bit about ratings agencies.
Right.
Moody's, S&P and Fitch had their role they should have had a role in forecasting the downfall of major institutions like Lehman Brothers, and Lehman Brothers had an investment grade rating just a few weeks before going bankrupt. Do you think they serve any useful purpose at all? Have they failed us, do you think?
I'm going to say something, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying it. I think that they completely and utterly failed us in the context of rating some of these instruments that they didn't understand. Having said that, in the corporate bond world, for example, they do a fine job. I mean, for the most part. We haven't had this situation happen. Look, in a perfect world, all investors would do their own research. We wouldn't need to rely on, outsourcing effectively research on these type of instruments to some other institution, like an S&P or a Moody's. But ultimately, I don't want to say we're a lazy society, but we're a society that is relying in part on these ratings. And then the question is, are these ratings right? And what is motivating the ratings? Meaning, was this just stupidity? Was this some kind of grab for cash? What were the incentives? What were the conflicts? And the hardest thing to appreciate or think about in the context of the rating agencies, unlike the bankers, which took enormous amounts of risk and walked off with enormous amounts of cash. There's nobody at the rating agency that has its own private plane. It didn't happen. So then the question is, why did they make these decisions? And I think a large part of it, frankly, was stupidity. And what do you do? How do you regulate that? Real issue.
Indeed. One case we're following here in Europe, again from the other side of the Atlantic, the class action suit brought about by 1 million female employees at Walmart. Now, Walmart is, of course, the biggest retailer in the world. Do you think a company could be, to adapt the title of your book, could it be too big to sue?
Well, I don't know if Walmart's too big to sue. I, by the way, think it is too big to fail. In the U.S., we've been talking about what we're calling systemically important institutions. Walmart is clearly one of those institutions. On the too big to sue issue, the question in the Walmart case is, can what's going on around the country, can you, potentially at many different Walmart stores, can you actually group them all together and say that there was a pattern in practice that ran across the country? Or did it happen on an individual basis and each story is a different story? And can you sue Walmart individually? That's really the question. By the way, you can. Can you do it in a profitable way? Is it an efficient thing to do? No. And so there is a larger question about what do you do about these large institutions and what kind of rights labor ultimately has.
So do you think there are other large companies on the horizon that may be set to fail along the lines of Lehman Brothers yet more in the future, or do you think we've learnt our lessons? Do you think we've...
I'm not worried tomorrow about another crisis driven by a financial institution. The next crisis we have, in my estimation, is going to be driven, if we have it, by the debt and leverage that countries have taken on. Now, what may happen ultimately is it manifests itself in the context of banks, right? Banks and other investors who own too many of the bonds. That's how you would see it. But it's not going to be driven by new risk that has been put on today. I mean, very interestingly, post most crises, risk comes down materially because people do have memories. It's 2, 3, 4, 5 years later where they start to put that risk on. And we haven't seen that part yet. So I think we're looking at a sort of a different situation at the moment.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. My guest today has been Andrew Ross Sorkin, author of Too Big to Fail, which is just coming out as a movie, which we'll all enjoy watching. Thanks for watching France 24. Do stay tuned. More news coming up shortly. Voilà.